This is the first of a series of recordings I intend to register in August 2022, and it is destined to be heard and listened to by my dear grandchildren, Lily, Mabel, and Ibrahim, as well as any child or any person who would like to hear these accounts of what it was like to grow up in an Austrian village in the middle of the last century. So this is the first. The village I grew up in was a fairly prosperous and old village. It was situated on important crossroads that had already been in use in Roman, even pre-Roman time, to transport salt, tin, wine, and oil from the different directions across the Alps. And although it wasn't a major crossroad, still the main path ran alongside it. It was a broad valley, and the various paths had come down from the mountainsides and made progress easier. So this habitation, which was called Weißkirchen, called White Church, because there had been the name is not that old, I think, but while I was there, the church was certainly whitewashed in white, and one could see its tall neo-Gothic steeple across all the fields in that rather broad and flat valley of the River Mur. Anyway, my father was not from the countryside, nor was my mother. They were both townspeople, and they had both grown up in the capital of Styria, in Graz. But my father had trained as a doctor, and he sought to make his living as a general practitioner. It was not easy after the war to find such a position. When I was born in 1951, the fate of Austria, which as part of Hitler's Germany had suffered defeat by the Allies, was still uncertain, and it was occupied by the Allied forces, one part under English, one part under Soviet Russian, one part under French, and one part under American control. There were different sectors. And a lot of the institutions were not properly functioning yet. It was only 1955, when Austria became an independent and neutral republic, that the foreign troops finally left and Austria could rebuild. Germany was much ahead in this respect to Austria, because everyone recognized that this time they must not punish the Germans too hard. Anyway, when I was born, it was very hard for a doctor in the Austrian countryside to make a living. And I was born in a different county, and nobody had any money. And occasionally people would bring a basket of eggs or a side of smoked bacon from their own pigs that they had slaughtered, lots of mushrooms in the late summer, and fat. But it was not really enough to live on. My grandmother helped a bit, but it was a hard life. And my mother and my father really didn't know how they could manage, especially when my little sister was also born a year and a half after me. But as luck would have it, he did find a position in this different village, the one that I was just talking about. And there the people were wealthier, the peasants were not such hard-pressed peasants, but owned sizable land. There was cattle raising as well as arable crops and a lot of forestry. There were also some workmen. There was a factory making textiles. There was a brown coal mine not far away. So there was more potential for a doctor, although he was the third doctor in the village to establish himself. So this was the situation. And we moved right into the main square, into one of those old late medieval houses, solidly built, 1 story high, with a vaulted ground floor. And there my father rented the first floor, where he established his practice, which comprised a waiting room, a practice room, and another treatment room. And we all had one room where we ate and played, and a tiny kitchen, until eventually they built a bedroom and a little room for our um, help. It was a young girl who helped, who cooked and looked after us next to it, and a bathroom. So then life was a bit less crammed, but it was still crammed. Anyway, in this old house there we lived, and at the corner was a sort of inn, and there was a girl there, a year older than me, and we played with her in the yard. It was a tiny, scrubby yard, and a bit. My mother didn't really like us to play there because the drunken people would come and pee there, and it was a bit smelly. But anyway, we didn't mind. We quite liked playing there. And next to it was a very large walled garden that belonged to another, much more prosperous and larger inn or restaurant. They had their own land, and they cooked all their own produce there. It's beautiful. They also had a slaughterhouse. And in that large walled garden, which was also hundreds of years old, they grew all the vegetables and fruit. And sometimes we would climb over the wall and help ourselves to some fresh peas or carrots, but they generally looked after that garden quite well and chased us away. So when we got there, obviously we were still quite small and toddlers, and we spent most of our time with that maid who was looking after us, who would take us out for walks in the surrounding fields. But then we started attending the kindergarten, and that was a lovely kindergarten. We were very happy there. They entertained us with all sorts of very simple games and toys, not many toys, but some toys. Our favorite toy, for instance, was a soft bit of wood and very soft nails, and we could just nail these nails into that soft wood and then pull them out again and then nail them in again. It was endlessly fascinating. It was my favorite occupation there. But of course, we also painted pictures, as people do now. And we sang a lot, and we danced a lot, and we went on excursions. And this kindergarten was run by the local church. Now, it was a Catholic church, Austria being a Catholic country, especially the countryside was completely Catholic. And the priest of our Catholic church was a very kindly priest, and he loved having the children come to church. He always made the children sit in the front rows, boys on one side, girls on the other. And we were even, can you imagine, we were allowed to play in the church. The church was always open. And we could play hide and seek beneath the benches. We could hide in the confessional cupboards where people go to confess their sins. There are sort of curtains there, and it was very good to hide there. We weren't supposed to do that, but we did, and he didn't really mind. Behind the altar where they kept half-broken statues, and especially the tower with the bells. And the bells were very powerful because it was a high tower, and sometimes if you ran We got pulled high up into the tower. I was quite scared. And when the priest heard that we'd rung the bell, he came straight away and said, "No, you mustn't ring the bell," because ringing the bell usually meant that somebody had died. And people kept running to him asking who had died, and he had to say, "Oh, it was those naughty children again who were playing with the bells." We also loved the church because of what it contained. It was a neo-Gothic church, so it wasn't a really old church. It was a Victorian church, not more than maybe 130 years old by the time we were there. But it was well done, looking a bit like a French church with a very tall steeple in the middle. And it had some quite nice pictures. And the pictures we particularly liked were on either side of the altar. One showed Jesus as a young man with brown hair, a curly beard, and a friendly smile, who was holding his dress, well, his robe apart on his chest, and you could see there his open heart. And this open heart, painted quite simply like a heart, not like a medical heart. And this was crowned with thorns. And on the other side was a picture of his mother, Mary, similarly in her blue veil, and she also showed us her heart. And her heart was pierced with a dagger and had also a crown of thorn. I was endlessly fascinated by these pictures and would watch them during the services. And the services were nice generally, and we sang all sorts of popular stories. And our favorite time was in May, which is the month of Mary, where there was a big fuss made of the children, and we could go there, the girls all dressed in white every day, and do some special prayers and sing special songs to the Holy Mary. And we also liked the processions. A few times a year, some of the statues were taken out, for instance, on the Ascension Day. And under a canopy, under an embroidered canopy, the priest would carry the sacrament in its golden casing, preceded by the choir and the altar boys swinging incense, and behind him came the brass music, and then came all the other people. And along the way, he stopped and we sang some prayers, and the boys let off some of these little cannons, which made a terrific noise, but was great fun. And that's how it went on, practically all morning until the early afternoon, and people were exhausted again. And we would strew flowers, the girls, and then pick them up again and run ahead. We could run back and forth and see what's happening and play a bit with it. But it was a wonderful occasion. And the church and the kindergarten also arranged for carnival parties where we danced and ate wonderful Austrian donuts and sang songs. So that was a very nice, rich life. My parents were not religious, but they thought they would not stop us from taking part in these, for us, great fun activities. This was the church who dominated the village from afar, and which for us was a very welcoming and nice and I could say even fun place, not just for us, but for all the children, which is quite unusual. Some people have quite different memories of the church. We never found it a hard place or a punishing place. Now, as we grew older, we went to school later than children do in England. We only started full schooling when we were 7, but then it was serious. And the school was only in the morning, from 7:30 until 12:30, or 8 till 1, something like that. No teaching in the afternoon, and there was no wasting of time. It was sitting down and working. And the school was a separate building at the outskirts of the town with a uh, staircase in the middle and in the classrooms on either side. And it was run by the director, who was strict but fair. And we had our classrooms, tall classrooms, heated by a tiled stove in the winter, and a great big blackboard, and we all sat in rows, girls on one side, the boys on the other, and no getting up during lesson, no asking things without being asked first. It was very strict discipline there, but then we were already 7. And there we straight away had to begin by learning to write, first on sort of rough paper with pencil, and then we graduated to fountain pens, or rather, not fountain pens, but pens you dipped in ink. You don't see those anymore. And that was quite hard to control the ink without getting ink spilled everywhere. And then, only when at the end of these first 4 years of primary school, could you progress to what was called a fountain pen, which had cartridges and didn't blot your paper all over the place. Yes, and then of course we had mathematics lesson, and one of my favorite lessons was natural history, because our teacher would take us out into the forests and the fields, and we would pick up stones or flowers or creatures that we found, and then we put them on a special shelf in the corridor, and then the teacher would put little cards saying the name of the flower, and then talk about it and explain what it was. And in a similar way, they also took us around the village to explain the history, because it had an old history. All sorts of wonderful things had happened there. In the Middle Ages, in the 13th century, there was a very wealthy and well-known knight who was also a poet. In fact, he wrote one of the most important poetry in the early days of writing in German that we still have. And his castle was perched on a very steep rock that was a ruin, of course, for a long time. But you could still see this imposing ruin. So this was our knight. His name was Ulrich von Liechtenstein. And then there was a house where Napoleon, the French emperor who had invaded Austria in the beginning of the 19th century, he had come through our village. And there were still bullet holes in some of the old buildings. And then there was a house where there had been a flood, and you could still see the watermark, and so on. There were all sorts of interesting things that we could learn about. So school was fun, generally, and interesting. But I had difficulties. I had difficulties in mathematics. I never could get my head around figures, but in the end, it took a while also for me to learn how to read, but then that was it. I loved reading. And we also had physical education, which was gymnastics and all that sort of thing. And we had a nice room dedicated to that, and I loved that too. So school was nice. The classes weren't that big, and some of the children stayed in primary school until they were 14, because they were not bright enough to progress to the next stage. But maybe their parents had been alcoholics, but they were good-natured enough, and they stayed there. In the end, they left school and they had done their compulsory schooling. So as I said, we went to school in the morning. It wasn't very far. We could walk to school. It was 5 minutes. And then we came home for lunch, which that maid had prepared, or sometimes my mother. And in the afternoon, we were free. Well, we did a bit of homework. That took maybe half an hour, not much homework. And then we were free to do exactly what we wanted. My parents told us to come back as it grew dark, and that was it. We were out. And we would meet our friends, and we would go and amuse ourselves in the village. For instance, we would like to visit different craftspeople. There was a man who was a weaver. He had a loom and he made sort of rag rugs out of people's old clothes that he cut into strips and then wove into a carpet, different sizes. And we liked to watch him, and people didn't mind a few children as long as they behaved sitting there, and sometimes he gave us a few rags to play with. Or the carpenter, he worked with wood, he made furniture, he made all sorts of things. It was a very old fashioned carpenter shop with no electric tools. He made everything by hand. And it smelled nicely. It smelled of sawdust and of fresh wood and of that glue he used. And it was a very old house, the carpenter's uh, workshop and his house. He lived in the same house as he worked in. And sometimes he gave us a bit of putty that he used to fix the windows in their frames. It's a malleable substance, a bit like Play-Doh, and made of clay and an oil, a linseed oil that had a very particular smell. And we would use it like you do Play-Doh nowadays. We made little figures or snakes and all that sort of thing until we got tired of it. He made us buy it. He made us buy like a kilo of it for, I don't know, now it would be like 5p. But it gave us a sense that this was something precious and you wouldn't waste it completely. So that was the carpenter. And then there was also the blacksmith, and that was very exciting because the blacksmith was working on an anvil on real fire, and he was hammering the iron with a great big hammer, and he wore a sort of leather apron. It was dark and sooty there, and the sparks flew, and we had to be very careful and stand right back. He didn't want us to come too close to where he worked the iron. And he also shod horses. You know, the feet of horses get worn down very quickly if they have to go on paved roads or stony roads. So they have horseshoes fixed to their feet. And these horseshoes were made by our blacksmith. So there would often be horses there to be shod, and they had to be held by one of his apprentices. And the horses stood there. I was always surprised that they never fidgeted. And he said it didn't hurt them. They have no more feelings in their hooves than we have in our fingernails when they get cut. But when he put the finished horseshoe on, it always smelled of burnt nail and smoked a bit and has a strong acrid smell. I quite like that smell. It's exciting. And right outside his smithy, he had fixed a swing, and one of our classmates was his daughter. And so she would let us have a go on that swing, and you could, from this swing, see into the workshop of her father and watch him hammer away at his iron and all that sort of thing. It was wonderful, just like in the old fairy tales. Nowadays, that still exists, but he doesn't shoe horses anymore, but he repairs cars, which is a sort of logical progression from a blacksmith to a car repair workshop. And there was also a tailor, a woman who uh, was making. There were several tailors, but we liked to go to one because she wasn't nervous and she let us watch her, and she sat on one of these treadle, not electric, old-fashioned sewing machines, and she made clothes. She made clothes for us too, and I loved all the little cut-offs. Her floor was strewn with little bits of bright fabric and buttons and needles and chalk and all sorts of things. So that was fun, spending a bit of time with her. And otherwise, of course, most of the people were farmers. And on a farm, there's loads of things to do and see. You could go into the stables and you could watch the little pigs, and you could go and see the cows being fed and milked in the evening. Again, in those days, there were no milking machines. They had to be milked by hand into a bucket, and it made a lovely sound and the milk was all foaming. Or we would go to the place where they made butter from the cream of the milk, and they used a little sort of barrel, a wooden barrel, where they put the milk in, and it had a handle, and you had to sit and crank the handle and turn it and turn it and turn it quite a while until the fat separated from the milk, and that was the butter. I quite liked doing that, but we got tired too because it took quite a while to tirelessly crank that. But he was very excited when she opened it, and there was a clear liquid and a lovely yellow, delicious butter would sit there in a lump, which they then put in a wooden mold with pretty patterns. So very nice butter. And of course, there was the hay barn, huge hay barns, where the hay was not in bales like now, but loose. And of course, it's much more fun to play in loose, soft hay or straw than in baled hay. And we would jump from one level of the barn to the next and hide in the hay and spend a lot of time there, especially in the summer. It was really nice. And we would also go out on the field if there was a time when the farmers were out in the field. This was before tractors. You have to imagine a world which was not so mechanized as now. Maybe one farmer had a tractor at the 1960s, but before that, they used either heavy horses, not sort of riding sprightly horses, but slow horses with big furry feet, or oxen, which were castrated bulls, and they were very strong, and they had a sort of wooden harness covered with leather, and they would pull the various machines or wagons. It was slow work leading the team of oxen or the team of horses, and of course we liked to watch that and maybe sit on one of these wagons and help a bit, putting potatoes into the ground or pulling them out or whatever needed to be done. As I said, we didn't so much sort of play as hang around and watch what the grown-ups were doing, but they didn't pay any attention to us. They carried on doing, and if we got too close to somewhere dangerous, they said, "Go away there," or "It's enough now, shoo." And we scrambled and went away. Of course, we also played, especially in the summer. We went into the forest and we played cops and robbers, or rather Indians and cowboys, and hid and chased each other and climbed trees and all that sort of thing for hours. Not always the same children, different children. We would find different friends, and you just say, "Oh, let's do this. Let's play there. Let's go so and so." And then we did. Not a swarm of children, but a few of them. And then when it got towards the evening, in the summer, of course, this was a bit later, although never as late as in England because it got dark there earlier. We went home, and then we washed, and we had some supper, and we told our parents a little bit, not everything of what we had been up to, and and then we went to bed, and the next day was more or less the same. So it was a very free life. As I said, the grown-ups did not particularly worry about us. Nobody asked, "What you're doing? Where are you?" Because they didn't really think that there were any dangers, and there weren't really any dangers. So I had to be a bit careful. There were accidents. For instance, there were still unexploded mines from the war. And if you played in one of these bomb craters, you had to be very careful. And one of the kids from one of the surrounding village did have his arm blown off. So that happened. You also had to be careful jumping in the hay barns. One of the boys in my class, he jumped from a high level and he jumped right to a hay fork. And it took one of his eyes out. So he had to have a glass eye made to match his other eye. Of course, he couldn't see through the glass eye, but it didn't look as awful as the empty hole. And sometimes when you asked him nicely, or when you gave him a little bit of money, 5p or so, he would take his glass eye out. He would and he would pass it round, and we would hold it in our hand and look at his interesting glass eye, or at his red empty eye socket. And then he spat on the eye, cleaned it a bit on his sleeve, and put it back in, and we had to tell him if it was the right way round. Sometimes we told him the wrong way round, and then that wasn't very nice of us. So there were accidents, and sometimes somebody drowned in the river, but generally, these were few and far between, those accidents. And you mustn't forget, our parents were a generation that had been through a terrible war, and they had seen, especially the men, terrible things. So they were not that bothered about what could happen in the village, you see. And that meant that the children had a free life, and this freedom was very precious. Now that I'm an old woman, I can see, especially in comparison to how children live nowadays, the children of a generation of parents who had never experienced the awfulness of a war, and they're terribly worried about the dreadful things that could befall their children, and they keep them more or less under constant surveillance. Anyway, that was not the experience we had. Okay, next time I will tell you something about shops and shopping.